Coral reefs cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, but are home to at least 1 million species and over 25% of all marine fish. While they are among Earth's most beautiful, unique, and diverse ecosystems, they are also one of the most imperiled. In the last 50 years, we've lost half the world's reefs, and the rate of loss is accelerating due to the impacts of climate change. Yet there's reason to remain hopeful. Not all reefs are lost, and we can save what's left if we act in time. This is Mike Fitz with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. Today, we're discussing coral reefs, specifically the coral reefs off the coast of Bonaire Island. Bonaire is a small island in the Dutch Caribbean, about 50 miles north of Venezuela, and is ringed by some of the healthiest reefs on Earth. But it's not immune to the changes we're imparting on the planet. And to help me explore this topic, my special guest today is Christine Ball, Board Secretary of the Harbor Village Reef Foundation. Christine, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, hi Mike, how are you doing?
Good. Christine partners with Explore.org to not only allow us to watch a portion of Bonaire's reef ecosystem. It's a beautiful webcam if you haven't seen it before. But she's also, along with a few other people, in the midst of an experiment to help corals survive the worst impacts of climate change. And we're going to talk to her about that during the chat today. So we'll talk about the basics of coral reefs and about that interesting experiment that's happening just offshore from where she is. If you have questions for Christine about coral reefs, please drop those into the chats. If you're watching on Facebook Live or if you're watching on Explore.org, you can scroll down to the bottom of the page there and drop your question in the chat, and we'll do our best to try to get those questions to Christine so she can answer those for you. But Christine, to start out, I think it might be good to introduce corals and coral reefs to our audience, because that's an ecosystem that not everyone has access to. It's limited in its extent. Like I mentioned before, it's only about covers a percent of the ocean floor, and the foundation of it is really based on an organism that is, well, a combination of a couple of different organisms in a symbiosis. So can you explain to us what coral is?
Yeah, coral is a very interesting animal. It has a few little special nuances to it. It's quite unique in the fact that it can clone itself. It has a series of polyps on the outside, which has its own mouth, its own reproductive systems. And those polyps are actually a direct clone of the one next to it. So it's a cloning animal. The whole of the coral is an animal. So those little polyps that are on there are not individual animals in their own right. The other real cool thing about corals really is that in those animal cells, those single cells of the coral there, we have an algae living in there, which is a symbiotic relationship, and those algae are called zooxanthellae. And zooxanthellae is actually what gives the coral its color. Coral normally is white. So that is a real cool thing about the whole animal. So cloning and the fact that it's got plant cells in there is real cool.
It is like a classic example of a symbiotic relationship. The corals really can't survive, the shallow water corals anyway, without their algae, or please pronounce the word for me again. Zoo.
Well, I'm hoping I got it right. Zooxanthellae.
Okay, thank you. I've read that many, many times. I've actually never heard anyone say it, so I didn't want to butcher the word any more than necessary. But yeah, a classic example of the symbiotic relationship. But not all corals are reef builders. Is that correct? That's correct.
Yeah.
So what makes a?
Go ahead.
So I was just wondering what might make a reef.
Okay, so initially what I was going to say, there's the symbiotic relationship with the algae. Algae actually photosynthesize, produce sugars, and that's how corals get most of their nutrition. As a result of that, what corals do is they produce a calcium carbonate layer, which they can grow upon, and that gives them more area to grow and more polyps to grow. And then the zooxanthellae then benefits because they have more space in the sunlight to be able to photosynthesize. That's where that symbiotic relationship comes into to play with those corals. And they actually, because they're building this calcium carbonate layer, they're actually building cement to grow other corals upon. So as corals maybe die out, then they've got another area for more corals to settle when they go through the reproductive process. They've got more areas of rock to grow upon, and therefore they keep going. If nothing changed with the coral, it would live forever. It just keeps growing. And that's how the reefs in the equatorial regions actually develop the way that they are. And it's taken millennia to actually get them to where they are right now. Unfortunately, it might not take a millennia for us to destroy them.
And the reefs in Bonaire are some of the healthiest in the world. So can you introduce us a little bit to the coral reefs that sort of encircle Bonaire? What would make them so special compared to other reefs in the world today?
Yeah, we do have one of the most pristine reefs in the Caribbean region, for sure. The color of the coral here is not maybe as vibrant as some people may think from corals from the Indo-Pacific regions. But we have a green, browny kind of range of coral color. That's not what makes it pristine. It's the structures of the corals that we have here, which is really, really good. And a major part of that is because we've had a national marine park here on Bonaire for the last 40 years. So we have very, very strict rules about what you can and cannot do in our marine park. Divers need to follow the rules, for instance, that we're not allowed to touch corals, we're not allowed to put hands down. We ban the use of gloves, which encourages people to grab hold of rocks and things like that, for instance. So all of that marine park, which was set up here, and it's the marine park is actually called Stinapa. That marine park has been a major impact on us having the reef that we have today. Because we've had such good control on what goes on here on Bonaire. And the marine park actually is the entire circumference of Bonaire and Klein Bonaire. So we've got around 2,700 acres of marine park here on Bonaire.
And when we watch the cam, it actually is quite obvious that the reefs are providing a lot of vertical structure for marine animals to survive. And I think that's one of the important points or characteristics of a reef is that vertical structure. And you can see that in other parts of the ocean that are very productive or diverse, like kelp forests, or even like behind me, you know, all the trees behind me, those provide vertical structure for animals. So we probably wouldn't have the diversity in coral reefs without the coral building that structure, right?
Correct, yeah, because that vertical structure gives the fish somewhere to hide, for instance. If you have a very a smooth, undulating reef, then there's nowhere for the nursery fish to actually get away from predators. So when the corals are actually allowed to grow bigger, upright, those little fish have somewhere to go hide in between all of those structures of those corals and then go bigger. So as a result, we end up with more fish. And we can see that definitely on Bonaire in the areas where it has more structure, we do tend to have more fish.
And speaking of fish, actually, that's one of the questions that's come up in our queue already. So what kinds of fish might live in a coral reef? That might be a tough question to answer because it can't, the variety of fish can be so diverse. But maybe we could.
I'll get my book. We see here on Bonaire, we don't have a great deal of pelagics. We're very far south in the Caribbean. We're only 50 miles from the Venezuelan South American coast. So in Bonaire, particularly on the west side where our reef cam is, we don't see the big pelagics. But what we do have is an abundance of reef fish. So we have a lot of varieties of parrotfish. We have angelfish, we have damselfish, we have scorpionfish. We have a lot of morays. Down here, we do get eagle rays and southern stingrays. And then you see the schooling fish, which we have online just there right now with the snappers. So we got mahogany snappers in who absolutely love our dome for some reason. And those kinds. So Creole wrasses we get here in abundance. So we have a huge variety of different sizes of fish, just not huge ones. We do have some of the bigger parrotfish, and I know our reef camera has actually caught the rainbow parrotfish that we have here on the island. Those are one of the biggest varieties that we have here. We also have the blue parrotfish and we have the midnight parrotfish. And I have seen a midnight on the camera occasionally. But around where the camera is, we get a lot of the bottom feeders. We get goatfish. We definitely have the French angelfish coming by. And certainly I know people see trumpetfish and trunkfish.
It's a beautiful scene to tune into. You know, you mentioned the dome, and we saw a little bit of a clip of that. And I want to get to questions about the dome because the experiment associated with it is fascinating. But before we get to that, it might be important for people to understand why the dome is there. Right now, of course, it's in the news a lot. Climate change is in the news a lot, as it should be, because due to the excessive burning of fossil fuels like coal and oil, we're forcing the Earth's ocean to warm. So how do reefs respond to rising ocean temperatures?
Reefs do not do well with anything that stresses them. So predominantly, I think climate change is one of the biggest attributors to the reef declining with rising sea temperatures. But a coral, if you change its pH, they like seawater, they like a certain temperature. If you change any of those factors, they become very, very stressed. And what seems to happen is the zooxanthellae actually produce too many sugars for the corals. And then the corals then try to expel some of that. They just can't seem to deal with it in a very economical way. So they get rid of the zooxanthellae from the cells. And basically they end up starving themselves to death because they end up losing most of their food source. And that's usually attributed mainly to rising sea temperatures. We had the El Nino came in 2016, and then we have documentaries that recorded the problems that caused in the Great Barrier Reef, where a huge area of that shallow reef was actually dying out rapidly in front of cameras. And that is having an impact here on Bonaire as well. We are seeing that our reef is actually moving further and further away from our shoreline. So where our fringing reef is actually moving backwards from us. And that's down to climate change. We've got temperatures which get up to 82 Fahrenheit, when the corals really like somewhere between 77, 78. We have hurricane damage, and we've also got a problem with, we have a loss of sea urchins in the Caribbean, which not a lot of people actually know about. Sea urchins were great at cleaning the reef. They're like the vacuum cleaners of the reef. And the fact that they're no longer there for us is causing the coral to suffer in health because they're being carpeted by other algae. So there's a lot of factors that are happening, and all of that is because of climate change, pollution, acid rain, and all things like that will put a coral under its stress is really going to decline the reef. And we are seeing that in one of the most pristine reefs in the Caribbean on Bonaire.
And there is, of course, a cascade effects associated with climate change. It's just not rising ocean temperatures, as we talked about, but as carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is absorbed by the oceans, it combines with water to make a carbonic acid. And now this is a fairly weak acid. It's not going to dissolve in or anything like that. It's not a very strong acid, but it still lowers the pH of seawater. So ocean acidification is a major impact of climate change on the ocean. So how does that impact the reef ecosystem?
Anything that changes what a coral likes is going to have the same stresses. So you change the pH of a coral, then around the coral is going to get stressed, and it's going to have the same impact. It's going to start going through that bleaching process as it starts to lose off that color from the zooxanthellae, which is why actually it's called bleaching, is because they go white, because they lose the color, because the algae is disappearing. So anything like that, we have a finite environment that we live in. I can go to the beach and I have a great time, but if you left me there for 3 days, I would suffer greatly. So if we have that, finite climate that we like to live in, a corals is so much smaller, and change any one of those factors and it's going to have the same similar impact.
Right, and corals, of course, can't get up and move like we can. If it gets too hot, maybe I can go in the shade, but they don't have that options, of course. So yeah, they are very much at the almost like at the mercy of those ocean conditions. On the cams, we're seeing a couple of domes, though. So it's unlike some of the other webcams on explore.org that largely just look at natural scenes. We don't see, the evidence of humanity like directly in those views. But there's a couple of rebar domes on the cams, and they're up front and center in a lot of those views. So can you explain the purpose of those domes?
Okay, so we're actually running an experiment of a technique of restoration, which has been around for a long time, called electrified domes. We're actually electrifying steel in the ocean to build coral. And one of the things that we wanted to do was we actually are involved with the Harbour Village Reef Foundation with an organization called Teens for Oceans. And in that Teens for Oceans, we encourage teenagers to actually explore the world of the ocean and the environment. So we designed a project for them to take part in, which would actually prove that an electrified reef would grow coral 3 to 5 times faster than a non-electrified reef. So what we've built, or we've had them build, is 2 domes. One is which we electrified and one that we didn't. And this particular project is concentrating more on boulder corals. So we started with a very small amount of coral just to see what would happen, rather than put a lot on there and find that it died out. So the one that's on screen at the moment, that is the non-electrified reef. And it's very, very different from the electrified reef, which is the one that just came up onto the screen right now, because that is the one that we've built that calcium carbonate on that dome itself. That's the one that's electrified. And you can see in the bottom of that picture, there is a little white J, and that is the anode for our electrical current. And that actually attaches to the steel rebar that we've got there. And then we go through a chemical reaction, which actually pulls out the minerals from the ocean water that adheres to the steel. So we're actually building the bedrock for coral. And the reason that we've got the camera in the middle of those is that we are taking a picture of those domes every day. And we can see a time lapse over time of our coral reef growing as a result of our electrified work. And that is a good way to actually these days to show people that this works. It's not just numbers on a page in a white paper. Here is the physical evidence of something that actually worked. And you can see the difference between one dome and the other in the same time frame. We even tried to put the same types of coral in the same positions on the domes originally, and we'll continue to do that just so that we're not doing, saying the factor behind it is the fact that the corals are different. So we're trying to get everything as similar as we possibly can.
And when were the domes installed? I mean, there is a big difference in what is growing and precipitating on the electrified dome versus the one that is not electrified. So how long has that process been undergoing on these ones that we're seeing?
We first put them in 2016, and we electrified them. We electrified the one that's gone white now, and it started to show signs of the accretion in 24 hours. We started to see the steel go white. So we knew we had the project right. And then it took us about 4 months before we put any corals on it. And then those corals have been there since. We've had some die. We've had some, maybe a couple more we put on just to see if that was a different problem with that particular type of coral. But since then, we've pretty much left them alone. And we go every now and then just to check and see what we're seeing with the project. And particularly the corals that are on the top, we just very loosely wedged them into the dome. And what we've seen reasonably quickly is that those corals on that dome that's electrified is now wedged. There's no way we can move them. They are actually very solid. Whereas on the dome that is not electrified, we can still move them. So there's a definite difference in what we've created. And we're also seeing now evidence of the coral actually starting to grow over our dome. So it's actually starting to spread over the structure itself, which is really, really cool. We've also seen on the electrified dome, I've seen a couple of Christmas tree worms have moved in. And we've seen sponges grow on there that we didn't put on there at all. So we're now thinking, is an electrified dome good for sponges rather than just coral? Whereas the other dome, the coral is just as we left it, pretty much. It's not making much difference whatsoever. In fact, in places I can see it growing around the rebar. It's not growing over it, it's actually just moving around it.
And how does a weak electrical current help stimulate the growth of these animals?
So we're actually running 2.5 amps onto the domes. And what happens is the current actually pulls out chemically the minerals, magnesium and the calcium, and it actually adheres to the steel and releases off the gases. So we have a more oxygenated environment, and that's why the fish like it, we think. And the theory is if we can do that, then the corals can also do that quicker, so that they should be able to build their substrate of calcium carbonate bone structure a little quicker, as well as actually providing an environment where they've got something to grow over, so they've got more space of something that we've built.
It is quite fascinating to see this process, but I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea at home and think, oh, I'm going to start licking 9-volt batteries and all of a sudden I can, grow strong muscles. It doesn't quite work like that. But we are seeing some pretty impressive results just over the last few years. So really, really neat stuff going on.
And we've got to a point in the project right now where we're actually in the first week of June. For those people that follow this particular camera, we're going to do some work with one of our partner schools from Miami are going to come in, and my plan is to just fill the domes now. We've seen it actually working. So we're going to fill both of them as much coral as possible. So we're going to see a lot of action on that camera from a human perspective. So there's going to be many, many changes in the next couple of weeks on the domes themselves.
Oh, wonderful. And before we get to some viewer questions, just a couple more questions that I have for you. Where can people read a little bit more about coral reefs and the work that you do?
That's a good question. We have a partner organization that does restoration, which we're all part of, which is the Coral Restoration Projects. They have a lot of information. There's lots of information on the internet. If you do searches on biorock or electrified reef, you can actually come up with quite a lot of information about what goes on there. Teens for Oceans has a really nice information, or people, if they want to ask me questions on the channel, then I can try and answer as many questions on there as I possibly can, or find references to particular areas if people want to find them. I can put up links to there if that helps people out as well.
All right. And what do you find most inspiring about coral reefs and the oceans?
If we don't have a coral reef, we don't have a world necessarily. It's one of the things that actually keeps the world revolving. We have a bedrock here of the fish sources. It's all part of the hierarchy. It's beautiful to look at. I'm a scuba diver by trade. And it's just awesome just to be there. So if there was no coral reefs, there would be no fish. And it's just such a shame that I think that a lot of people don't experience the reefs in the way that I get a chance to personally. And that's one of the reasons for us, the way they are, is that we can bring those to the people who can't experience those things the way that we do here in Bonaire particularly, and the people who come and visit the reefs. They're just beautiful to look at, and if we don't have them, then I think the world would start to flounder.
Right, we can't keep pulling threads out of our sweater and expect it to keep us protected from the weather. So definitely, coral reefs are almost, I want to say, almost in a state of crisis. I mean, we do really need to tackle climate change now to protect these ecosystems.
Yeah.
But it is, a beautiful camera right now to watch. A lot of life on it. Chris, would you be willing to answer a few viewer questions with the remaining time that we have?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. So one question that has come up in our queue here is somebody was wondering why they're not seeing sharks on the Bonaire cam. It seems like, maybe some of those big predatory fish, that niche is taken up by perhaps different species. You were mentioning something about how you don't see a lot of pelagic species on there. Is that maybe why you don't see sharks on the camera?
Yeah, we don't. We're an island of two halves. We have a windward side. So just to explain Bonaire's location just a little bit more, we get the trade winds from Africa. There's nothing between us and Africa. So our east coast is very, very rough. The corals are a lot bigger. People don't live on that side of the island, and certainly it is less touched by divers and snorkelers and people. We do see more of the sharks on that side of the island than we do on our leeward side, which is the west coast. And we also have a very short drop between the main reef of the main island and then Klein Bonaire. My location here at Harbour Village is only 800 meters from Klein Bonaire. So the actual bottom, our reef is from around about 10 meters down to 60 meters. That's the bottom. Then it sands out and then shallows and then comes back up to Klein Bonaire. And I don't think that is a fantastic area for the sharks and everything to be in, because it's just a little bit too shallow for them. I think the topography doesn't fit. That is just completely anecdotal on my part. I don't know if that's scientifically correct or not, but we do occasionally see whale sharks around. There have been 4 in the last 8 years that have come through. We get nurse sharks on the East Coast. However, we do see reef sharks. We see hammerheads occasionally, and we'll see some whale sharks, but definitely not on this side. From a location of the camera is only in around about 33 feet, so 10 meters. And again, that topography is not fantastic for sharks to be coming by. Maybe we'd be lucky if we get the odd nurse shark.
We have a couple of questions about reefs in other part of the world. It might be a little bit out of your wheelhouse, but maybe you could speak to the health of reefs in general around the world. Somebody was wondering about the health of coral reefs in North America. So perhaps along the Florida Keys, do you know anything about their status and their overall health?
Yeah, they're suffering a lot more. The Gulf actually has a lot higher sea temperatures than we have down here in Bonaire. And they're definitely seeing a huge loss in the structures of corals such as elkhorn and staghorn. In fact, there are projects up there which are actually trying to restore the reef, and they've got hundreds of trees where they're growing elkhorn and staghorn corals just to try and bring that structure back. So they're definitely suffering in that region for sure, although they do seem to have more of the pelagics up there.
And another question, this one's a little bit about the Great Barrier Reef, but I think we can ask this, and you could perhaps talk about how it applies to reefs around the world. Somebody's just wondering how long it took the Great Barrier Reef to form, but we know that coral reefs aren't something that just pop up overnight. So how long does it take for something like the Great Barrier Reef to form?
It takes millions of years for these things to grow. The shallow corals grow very, very fast. So elkhorn and staghorn, the branching corals, they can grow up to 2.5 centimeters in 6 months in every direction. But the big boulder corals, which really are the structure, and the deeper corals, they take a very, very long time to grow, so hundreds of years. And it's really, really sad when we see destruction or graffiti being cut into, a big coral head somewhere, which, like a brain coral. They're actually destroying something which is hundreds and hundreds of years old.
And a couple of final questions. Somebody was wondering what you mentioned that you had plans to fill the inside of the dome with coral, but they're kind of wondering what that might do to the fish. Will they likely be displaced from that structure?
It is possible that we displace the fish. We're not going to put them on the inside of the corals. We're going to put them on the outside of the domes. Okay. If for some strange reason, fish like to go in nets and things like that. They put themselves in cages. They weren't there before we actually put the domes in. They managed to find a home there. I think they will find a home in the same region, or if they can get in, we will certainly try and find a way to help them stay in that environment if possible, because I would hate to lose them from the reef cam for people, because they're real cool to look at.
And a question maybe about invasive species. Do you have any species that are harmful to the coral in that area, or maybe just predators of coral in general?
Predators of coral generally are things like fireworms, sea slugs, flamingo tongues, things like that, crabs. Destruction of corals by predation comes also from parrotfish, where they scrape away coral trying to get different algae on the coral. As for invasive species, the biggest invasive species we have here is the lionfish, which is not necessarily detrimental for the coral itself, but for the reef fish that we have, because there are no predators here for the lionfish, and nothing knows that they are a predator. So that is actually bringing our reef fish numbers down. So that is the biggest invasive species that we have right now.
And just one final question, this one going back to the electrified dome. Again, the electricity that goes through that is safe for fish and divers, so it's not harmful to those creatures, correct?
Absolutely, it's 2.5 amps, and I have touched those domes many times as I've been checking the status of corals and the growth, and you don't even feel a tingle. I really don't think the fish would be in there if they felt it was a detriment to their life.
Well, Christine, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to speak to us today about coral reefs, and you know, specifically the reefs around your island in Bonaire. It's a fascinating, a beautiful webcam, a fascinating experiment that you're running. So I encourage everyone to tune in to that coral reef webcam, the Bonaire Coral Reef Cam, to learn more about it and get to talk with Christine in the comments. Drop a question there; she'll do her best to try to answer this. So Christine, again, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks very much. It was lovely to be here and talk to you.